much for joining us virtually for this. We thought it would be useful to give you a brief overview of the scientific evidence that's most relevant to the hunting trophies import prohibition bill. We're only going to talk for 15-20 minutes, so obviously this is going to be a whistle-stop tour through some of the evidence, and we can't go into it in depth, but we thought it would be useful to give a general overview. So to talk about who we are, I am Amy Dickman. I'm a Professor of Wildlife Conservation at Oxford University, the Joint CEO of Lion Landscapes, the Director of Oxford's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. I've got over 20 years of field conservation experience.
And I'm Dilys Roe. I'm the Chair of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group and a Principal Researcher with the International Institute for Environment and Development. And I've spent over 25 years working on that intersection between conservation and community livelihoods.
Thanks, Dilys. Both of us serve on DEFRA's Darwin Expert Committee, so we provide independent scientific advice about which scientific projects and conservation projects the government should fund. We both really share a strong professional commitment to effective, equitable and evidence-based conservation. We hope you agree that evidence really does matter, and this is particularly true with emotional and emotive topics like trophy hunting. So trophy hunting is a really emotive topic. So images like this of a couple who shot a lion or kissing behind it, showing their joy in this, seem really distasteful, and to everyone, myself included, to many, many people, that will turn people's stomachs. And particularly when it involves species like lions, giraffes, very charismatic and threatened species. This really drives a lot of vitriol towards topics like trophy hunting. But it's really important, despite those instinctive reactions that we have, that policy should still be led by the best available evidence. This reflects the Nolan principle of objectivity. The holders of public office should take decisions impartially, fairly and on merit, so using the best available evidence and without bias, including their own, and is a staple of government policy, as we all saw through, for example, COVID-19. And it's just as important that conservation is evidence-led, just as the same as science, as medicine or any other topic. And that's particularly true with something like trophy hunting, which affects vast areas and many species. Because of the media coverage, people tend to think of trophy hunting as very much an African activity. But actually, if you look at this map here, all the countries in green have trophy hunting permitted in some context. So it's a really worldwide topic. Unfortunately, despite the political commitment to objectivity and to evidence, misinformation is very extensive around trophy hunting in general, and particularly has got into debate around this particular bill. So, for example, in the second reading of this bill in the Commons, we found that 75% of all the checkable MP statements were incorrect. And for more than a third of MPs who spoke up in support of the bill, every single statement we were able to check was found to be incorrect. These are just a few examples. I'm not going to run through them all now, but just a few examples of the misinformation that came out in the bill. A small example is that this quote says, in countries where trophy hunting is now permitted, a blind eye is effectively turned to poaching. That's simply not true. There's extensive, well-documented anti-poaching activity across many countries which use trophy hunting. And we've analysed over 200 of these statements. And what they really reflect is an alarming influence of lobby groups and a lack of scrutiny during the process. So there are lobby groups on both sides of this issue. So, for instance, hunting groups raise money from those hunts, while anti-hunting groups raise money from ban campaigns. Lobby groups obviously tell simple messages to the media and to the public. We know that trophy hunting is a complex issue, but that doesn't tend to sell. What sells is those simple, easy messages that tend to get the public then to respond. The public email MPs, they all sign petitions, etc. And that all increases the pressure for political action, even if the information they're basing it on was not originally correct. And it's particularly alarming if those messages are misleading and if that misleading information leads to real world harms, as we believe is probably the case here. It's also interesting when we looked at the source of the false statements, where we could identify a source. In 80% of the cases, they came from one activist group, which seems to have access and influence, particularly through the APPG Secretariat. And that should be concerning to everyone regarding policy making, because as MPs have pointed out before, APPG shouldn't be a backdoor for peddling influence or gaining access to MPs. There's a real need for more scrutiny and fact-checking during the legislative process, which seems to be very hard to get. What's very obvious and what is sort of common in this debate is that conservation is a key concern. And that is really important. If you look at the Living Planet Index, there's clearly a major decline in important wildlife species across the globe. And so it's very important that we should all be concerned about conservation. Now, we often hear that trophy hunting is pushing endangered species close to extinction. That's often a central part of those groups pushing for bans. However, others say that it helps conservation. So what is the best available evidence? Well, in truth, it is mixed. Trophy hunting can indeed put pressure on some populations, particularly infanticidal species. So these are species like lions and leopards, where if a male is killed, then new males will come in and will kill the dependent cubs. So that can have a knock-on impact beyond just the targeted animals. It also puts pressure on if it's additive to other threats like human-wildlife conflict, poaching, etc. And so there are certain species, as I mentioned, lions and leopards, where trophy hunting has been proven to put pressure on certain populations, especially if quotas are high. There's also some evidence of negative selection for traits. So, for example, things like horn size getting smaller, if there's high intensity hunting focused on things like males with the biggest horns. So that exists, for example, with bighorn sheep. So Dilys and I and several colleagues have looked at where trophy hunting is mentioned as a potential threat on the red list, where it's mentioned in the threat category. We found 117 species where there was some mention of it, but actually when you looked at how it was mentioned, it was only mentioned as a possible or a mixed threat for 6 of those species. So hog deer, Javan, warty pig, these are the species you don't tend to hear about actually in the debate very much, as well as lion, brown bear, leopard and polar bear. But it's not as simple as just being a threat. It's not true that where there is no trophy hunting, there is no killing. And that's a really important point to remember throughout these debates. Trophy hunting is a regulated form of killing. Sometimes those regulations are flouted, but there are regulations there. So they're usually, the hunters are meant to target older males, which of virtually all species is far less damaging than the indiscriminate killing of females and young animals. It's important to note that for some species, there's real evidence for conservation benefits, even for those hunted species themselves and even for endangered species. So, for example, black rhino have had demonstrable conservation benefits linked to trophy hunting. And there have also been conservation benefits for other species, argali, markhor, white rhino, bighorn sheep, etc. Critically, when we looked at the red list data, we couldn't find trophy hunted listed as a key threat for any species. So it's certainly not one of the major driving forces, even for species like, say, lion, where it's listed as a potential threat for some populations. The major threats to wildlife are habitat loss, poaching, and conflict with people. And critically, and very counterintuitively to many people, trophy hunting can actually help reduce those bigger threats. It provides revenue linked to the presence of wildlife, so it incentivizes habitat protection, and it helps fund anti-poaching, for example. If you look at this is a map from Tanzania, and as we've talked about, one of the major threats to wildlife is habitat loss, and that red shading you can see is agricultural land conversion. Now, if you look at the white areas and the green areas, those areas have very little agricultural land conversion. So something is working, not perfectly, but something is helping reduce those threats in those areas. The white areas are areas where trophy hunting is permitted, and the green is where it's not permitted. So both of those areas, that's national parks, game reserves, wildlife management areas, etc., are having a protective effect. This map does need to be updated because some of these areas have now switched to photographic tourism, but it shows that wildlife-based land uses, including trophy hunting, can reduce those bigger threats. And the revenue is also important. It helps fund protected areas, both hunting and non-hunting. So in fact, around 2/3 of Tanzanian protected areas are at least partially dependent upon trophy hunting. But we've talked about the fact that trophy hunting can be a risk. How big it is to certain populations or species really depends on the context. So people often just don't understand how could removing any risk possibly cause harm. So if you look at this in a very complicated way, with lions, for example, what tends to happen is that you will have a multiplicity of threats. So many different threats going on. Trophy hunting may be a minor threat, but in general, the bigger ones are usually things like habitat loss, the loss of wild prey, and conflict with people. And those are really driven by a lack of investment in conservation. Now, if you take away trophy hunting, you take away that minor threat. What often happens is that if you've got no better wildlife-based land use ready, then that will lead to more loss of habitat, and with that, more loss of wild prey, more conflict with people because there's less buffer between, say, national parks and human communities. And because of the fact that then there's less prey, there's fewer jobs, there's less money around, and then you've added to the problem of the lack of investment. And that ultimately leads to fewer lions, for example. So why is this dependent on trophy hunting? Why can't it just be replaced, say, with phototourism? So there's definitely evidence that species like lions, for instance, generally do better in phototourism than trophy hunting areas. But again, there's marked variation by species and area. But it's really important to remember that lions tend to also do better in trophy hunting areas than in areas that have neither photographic or trophy hunting. So what you need to do is to make sure that we avoid this idea of trophy hunting areas being abandoned and converted to, say, agriculture or land use, because that will be negative for wildlife. So how easy is it to switch that trophy hunting to phototourism? Well, unfortunately, probably not that easy. Already with all our existing revenue streams, so with phototourism, trophy hunting, state aid and donor aid, around 90% of the protected areas with lions fail to cover their costs. So these red countries will show where over 90% of the need for protected area funding is currently unfunded. So there's already a huge gap in the market for funding. And when trophy hunting is undermined, including through domestic bans, through import bans, etc., there's very little evidence of photographic uptake. That's been seen in Botswana with the ban there, in Tanzania, where we see many vacant hunting blocks not being taken up by photographic operators, and in Namibia, where modelling of the removal of trophy hunting from conservancies leads to many of the previously profitable areas becoming unprofitable in terms of wildlife conservancies, and that has a negative impact for people and wildlife. And the reason for this is that trophy hunting areas often aren't ideal for phototourism. So for instance, Markhor in Pakistan, this can generate a lot of revenue for one animal being trophy hunted, but actually it's unlikely to get lots of tourists in there because it's rugged, it's inhospitable, it's not a top tourist destination for many international visitors. And so what we need really is more options, not fewer on the table. And it's also important to note that import bans still undermine revenue, or they run a major risk of undermining revenue. So even though the bill that is being debated is not about banning trophy hunting per se, it's about banning imports, those kinds of actions that can restrict or undermine trophy hunting have been clearly warned against from the IUCN and others without taking those steps to ensure that there are better wildlife-based options ready. Regarding animal welfare, that's another key concern driving calls for bans. And those concerns are clearly genuine and need proper consideration as part of these discussions. But it needs, again, to be a rounded consideration. There are major animal welfare concerns if trophy hunting is undermined, for example, through import bans, without those better options ready. So this graph shows you the proportion of illegal human use in different game reserves. The black ones show actively hunted game reserves, and the grey ones show vacant hunting areas. So actively managed hunting zones and vacant hunting zones. So in the vacant hunting zones, there's a lot more illegal human use, and that's probably then linked to more poaching, more snaring, etc., with damaging impacts for wildlife. And those kinds of killings are much worse in terms of welfare. So we have to be very careful not to have these unintended consequences. It's also worth noting that trophy hunting only usually affects the target species, whereas bans, if they lead to these increased killings, poachings, land clearance, etc., those kinds of killings will be indiscriminate and much worse in terms of animal welfare. So, for example, a poisoning is likely to affect many vultures, critically endangered vultures, as well as the target species. I'm going to move over to Dilys now. He's going to talk more about revenue and local communities.
Thanks, Amy. So yes, moving on from the direct conservation impacts and the animal welfare impacts, it's also really important that we ensure that any decisions that are taken by the UK government and any UK legislation doesn't undermine the rights of local people in faraway countries to manage and benefit from wildlife or to make contributions towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure we can all agree that that would be a form of neo-colonial tragedy if that did happen. But we frequently hear from people that dislike trophy hunting and want to see it banned that we don't need to worry about this because actually such a small amount of money from trophy hunting reaches local communities, so they won't miss it. And this figure of 3% of revenue reaching communities is frequently spread around. But actually that 3% figure is demonstrably false. And in fact, the author of the report from which that figure came has himself publicly refuted it. The figure comes from a report that was a snapshot in time in Tanzania before benefit sharing from trophy hunting started, so back in 2008. The situation in Tanzania has changed significantly since then, and that figure didn't apply to any other countries anyway. So a significant report on the African wildlife economy launched by the African Leadership University in 2021 showed that actually the local share of revenue from trophy hunting ranges between 20% and 100%, and all is very dependent on the specific policy context in each country. As well as revenue, it's important to note that trophy hunting also generates jobs and meat for local people. And these may be things that are dismissed as being insignificant, but they're not insignificant to the people that rely on. It also generates government revenue and fees that can help support conservation financing in other places where trophy hunting doesn't happen, so protected areas across the country. I think overall, the key fact is that actually trophy hunting is so highly variable that so is the percentage of revenue that reaches local people. It varies hugely, as you say, from 20% to 100%. And if you compare countries like the UK and Namibia, in Namibia, where trophy hunting happens on communal conservancies, 100% of the income reaches local people. In the UK, where trophy hunting, or we call it here deer stalking because we don't like the term trophy hunting, where that occurs, it tends to occur on the land that's owned by a very limited number of very wealthy landowners. We also know that where bans have been put in place, they have had negative livelihood impacts. So in Botswana, for example, where a temporary ban was put in place between 2014 and 2019, where hunting was removed from particular areas, no tourism operators moved in except in one area. And so for those areas without tourism and without hunting, there was no revenue at all for local people, let alone a paltry amount from hunting. Furthermore, from PhD research, we know that there were significant livelihood impacts in terms of human-wildlife conflict, with elephants becoming bolder and trashing people's farms and trashing their crops, and also providing actual damage to people, preventing children from going to school, killing and injuring people. The final point is that the UK actually exports many thousands of trophies. So if we're so concerned about trophy hunting, why are we not stopping trophy hunting at home first instead of imposing a ban that will infect other countries, particularly African countries who do far better at conservation than the UK does? So perhaps we ought to put our own house in order before we start affecting conservation in other countries. It's clear that the UK is concerned about trophy hunting, and both the Conservative and Labour governments have made pledges to impose a trophy hunting import ban. We often hear that 9 out of 10 Britons want this ban, that the majority of the British public wants to see this ban. And when the government put out a consultation ahead of a proposed Animals Abroad bill, we heard that 86% of the 44,000 people who responded to that consultation wanted a ban. But again, there's some misinformation in these headline statistics if we dig a little deeper. In terms of the kind of polls that produce these 9 out of 10 figures, these are often generated by one-sided lobby groups and present very black and white questions. Do you like trophy hunting or don't you? Would you like to see it banned or wouldn't you? So it's not really surprising the kinds of results that it generates. If you ask the questions in a more nuanced way, then the answers are actually very different. So this graph shows the results of a poll which asked, again, the UK public, not just whether they would like to see trophy hunting banned, but would they still like to see it banned if it had a demonstrable negative effect on conservation? Or would they still like to see it banned if it had a demonstrable negative effect on local communities? And in both those cases, fewer than half of the people surveyed said that they would like to see it banned. So that's very different from 9 out of 10. Similarly, with the DEFRA consultation, yes, there were 44,000 responses, and 86% of those may have said they wanted to see a ban. But actually the vast majority of those 44,000 responses were cut and paste answers from campaign material. There were only actually 7,500 responses where people answered the questions that DEFRA had set. And within that, there were only 50 or so responses that actually provided evidence to back up the answers that were provided. And of those responses that provided evidence, 75% of those were not in favour of a ban. So I think it's really important that we read beneath headline statistics when we're making decisions about these things. The level of misinformation actually is really shocking when we think about the fact that we're forming public legislation here, and the majority of the information or the misinformation that is forming it is coming directly from lobby groups and seemingly unquestionably going into legislation. It seems that there are very few opportunities to check facts and to verify the information that is being given, especially with private members' bills. But it's not just with private members' bills. When the government was putting the Animals Abroad bill through the legislative process, hearings were scheduled by the Committee on Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. But only one hearing was heard, and that only involved pro-ban lobbyists. There were no hearings with conservation scientists or with local community representatives who have a direct stake in trophy hunting. And looking at the minutes of the committee hearings, it was absolutely striking how much misinformation was provided in those hearings, but again, not picked up on by the committee members and seemingly not questioned, and there being no process for questioning that. So, for example, an assertion that there's no point in considering exports of trophies from the UK because there are so few of them, it's such a minuscule number, but actually there are thousands. There's another point that was put across saying that there are actually only 1,500 rhinos still alive in Africa, but actually the figure is 22,000. It's an order of magnitude greater than was presented to the committee. But there's no way of contesting these claims and seemingly no process within government for checking them. There also appears to be a strong level of science denial amongst some of these lobby groups. So even when facts that are verifiable and have scientific evidence supporting them are put before these lobby groups, they will ignore them and continue to put forward misleading facts and figures or erroneous facts and figures, and appear to just be driven by a higher level agenda rather than what the evidence actually says. This is clearly the way lobby groups work, but from a policy-making perspective, it shouldn't be allowable, since policy should be based on evidence. The public and both public and wildlife do deserve legislation to be well considered and evidence-based in order to avoid any unintended consequences. The original commitment when the Animals Abroad bill was first mooted was for a ban on endangered species, but that was soon dropped, and the focus of the bill extended to a claim that it would protect 7,000 species, and it's actually very hard to see how that would happen. The draft text of the private members bill points to appendices of species that would be protected by this bill, just under 6,000 species. But bizarrely, this includes corals, jellyfish, amphibians, mollusks, bats, moths, and various other insects, all the kinds of things that clearly are not subject to trophy hunting. So how on earth could they be protected by banning trophy hunting? So if the bill is indeed meant to help conservation, which is what it says it's supposed to do, then clearly it needs to be implemented in a way that doesn't undermine conservation. And we suggest that this conservation exemption needs to be reinstated in the bill. So where proven positive effects on conservation can be demonstrated, as has been the case for rhinos, markhor and other species, then the bill and the import ban should not apply to them. And ideally, the decision about whether or not to ban the import of a particular trophy from a particular species should not just follow lobbying advice, but should follow the science. And over 200 experts have called for a smart ban rather than a blanket ban on imports, so that yes, we ban the kinds of trophy hunting that are not carried out properly and do have a negative effect on conservation, but that we don't ban trophy hunting that does have proven benefits for conservation or for communities. This smart ban could be formulated to allow imports where there is good governance, and it could be based on making sure that a positive contribution to conservation and communities is there, not just proving that there's no negative impact. So it could be very progressive from that perspective. And there are existing ways of tracking performance of sites and of operations, whether they're tourism or hunting or others. Established criteria and principles, such as the Green List for protected areas and other IUCN standards. And so a smart ban could build on these standards and would include assessing the benefits on habitat conservation, species conservation, local people's livelihoods, as well as demonstrating good governance. If campaigners are right and trophy hunting is indeed driving species to extinction, then those cases would not meet the criteria that would be set out in the smart ban approach. So there would be no fear of things slipping under the net and conservation continuing to be threatened. But if there are cases where trophy hunting does contribute to conservation, then surely we wouldn't want to stop it. We would want to continue it. And this would ensure that the ban wouldn't inadvertently undermine conservation where it is proving to be successful. Surely that is not what the public wants. We're very happy to discuss more how such an approach could be applied and the kinds of principles and criteria that would underpin it and the mechanism that would need to be deployed to apply it. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope this has provided some insights into how complicated this issue is, but equally some of the evidence that underpins some of the claims that have been made. Many thanks.